to Bible Backstory. Now we're in our third of our quick overview of the Old Testament, and we're going to pick up the story in the time right after Moses and as the people go back into the Promised Land to capture it. And so Joshua leads the charge, and it's all about the land. They come in, they cross the river, they put the ark in the river and they cross over. They run around Jericho a couple of times with the ark, and then they sound the horns, walls fall over. That takes care of that city. They go up here to Ai, and there's another battle there. That goes fairly well, and then they split. The ark and half the army goes north, and the other group goes south. Now Jerusalem is not really much of a city at this point, so they're heading mostly for Hebron, which is the largest city in the southern part, and Hazor up at the top. There's a variety of things that happen in the campaign. I invite you to sort of read through the book of Joshua if you understand how that is. But in the end, they take all the people who had moved into this territory when they left to go to the children of Abraham left to go to Egypt when Joseph and his brothers, that story. The people who moved in here have to get run out, and that's exactly what happens during the campaign in the book of Joshua. They're not real happy about it. They get driven out because in the end, these people who have grown up in the desert are hungry and they're really ready to battle. And they have God on their side, and they understand that. And so it goes well for them, and they're all chased out of the area. And Joshua becomes a conquering icon. And so we'll divide the lands up. I'll show you that in a second. And then at the end of the book of Joshua, Joshua gives this great farewell address, which if you want to summarize the first 6 books of the Bible, just go to the end of Joshua and read what Joshua says. As for me and my family, we will follow the Lord. We divide the land up. So now there are 12 tribes, but there's 11 divisions. The tribe of Judah gets the biggest chunk down in the south, but each tribe gets a little bit. Now where are we? This is the Mediterranean Sea, this is the Jordan River, Sea of Galilee, Dead Sea down here. Gilboa, which is as close as we can get to the city of Jerusalem at this point. Jerusalem is going to wind up right here on the border between the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. The other tribes get parts. For some reason, the tribe of Dan gets 2 parts. They get one up here on the river and one by the Mediterranean Sea. I guess they had the cruise industry. I'm not sure. The only one tribe of Israel, of Jacob, the 12 tribes, that doesn't get land is the tribe of Levi. They're the ones who will be the priests. They'll be the ones who help the people worship God. And so they don't get a particular part of land, they get parts of all the major cities and are scattered amongst the cities. Now, as I said just a minute ago, they chased all the people out, but that doesn't mean that they left or that they were happy about being run out. And so the Philistines down here, the Moabites, the Amalekites, the Ammonites, and the Canaanites all go back. So just because Joshua conquered the land doesn't mean that the warfare is over and that the battles have ended. And that is what the book of Judges is about. The book of Judges then says what happens when we all try to exist as a tribal league of 12 tribes. And what we see very quickly is this sort of cycle. The people of a tribe do evil, and they are overrun by a ruler, the Philistines, the Amalekites, the Canaanites. The people then cry out to their God. God raises up a righteous local leader, a judge. This is not a guy in a robe in a courtroom. This is a tribal leader. This tribal leader is then infused by spirit from Yahweh and defeats the enemy. And things all go back to being peaceful until the people sin again. And the sin here is mostly idolatry. Not completely, but largely it's idolatry. And at some point, this cycle goes over and over and over and over, and it never seems to end. And each tribe, one tribe goes through it, and then another tribe goes through it, and somebody finally says, maybe we need to re-examine what's going on here. This cycle is just not conducive to living as an example to the rest of mankind. it comes to a question of monarchy versus republic, if you will. Do we need to have localized governance sort of working together, or do we need a national king? That's the question. What that will do then is actually break the concept of a judge, which is a regional tribal leader filled with God's Spirit and leader of the people, into two different types of people. The second one is a king, a gubernatorial person who may or may not abide with God, and a prophet, a Nevi'im, is a theological person whose inspirations come from Jehovah, from Yahweh, from God. That is the person who speaks for it. So a prophet here is not a fortune teller like you see on late night TV. This is someone who hears from God and speaks for God, generally to a king who is an appointed leader of the people. We will see three primary kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. So but first, let's meet the first of the prophets, perhaps the greatest of them, and that's Samuel. And here's some accurate pictures of what Samuel looked like. Born about 1080, he was given over at a very young age to the high priest at Shiloh, given to Eli. He hears his calling early. In fact, Eli says, look, if you keep hearing from God, I think he's got something planned for you. And indeed he does. He becomes a key leader in the battle against the Philistines. And he is entrusted then, when they said, okay, this set of tribal leaders isn't working, let's have one national king. They turn to Samuel to say who should be king. He will then consult, and we'll examine in a minute how you do that. He will find out and will pick Saul of the tribe of Benjamin, the smallest of the tribes, Benjamin. That's who will have the first king. Samuel tries his best to make Saul be a good king. It doesn't go well. And in the end, Saul finally Samuel confronts Saul of his failings, and then God says, I'm no longer going to have Saul as king. I'm going to remove him from being the king and pass that along to the next king, who will be David. We'll explain that in a minute. How do you know who to pick? How do you know what God wants? Well, there are a couple of ways you can do it. First of all, he can tell you directly. He talked to Moses, right? Burning bush. He told God. God told Moses what to go do. God can tell a prophet what to tell you, and that's the second way to do it. Sometimes God can send it to you in a dream. Or you can roll the Urim and Thummim. The Urim and Thummim, well, we're not sure. We think they might have been dice. They were holy sticks or holy stones or something. We really don't know because they didn't survive. But this was part of the priestly garments and were used to determine what God's will was. And this is how Samuel decides who will be king. He picks the tribe, it's Benjamin. He picks the family, he picks the person in that family, winds up being Saul. This is called claromancy, when you try to use a physical object to determine God's will. But it is what they did. You can actually go on the internet and buy Urim and Thummim. They're not the originals, but you can buy them online if you'd like. And the two words, Urim and Thummim, are actually in this logo, which, if you don't recognize it, is the coat of arms of Yale University. Who knew? The other way you can find out what God wants is that you can figure it out on your own, which is what most of us probably wind up doing. Or you can wait till he sends his son. But that's another story, a little later. King Saul, of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, smallest tribe, but the biggest guy. Saul's huge, right? For the general population. It's not as big as Goliath will be, but Saul is a big guy. Here's Samuel introducing him to the people. And when he goes and introduces them, they can't find him. He says, who's going to be a king? Oh, it's going to be from Benjamin. Oh, okay, hey, Benjamin. And they point to Saul. Saul's not around. Saul's hiding somewhere. He's hiding behind the baggage. People are going, well, we're not too thrilled. So the other tribes are not real thrilled. I think the tribe of Judah, being the largest, would have thought that they would get the king. But no, it's the smallest tribe. But that's what Benjamin got. I mean, Benjamin got that because Samuel rolled the dice, and that's who it came up. Things don't go well. Saul's constantly having to battle the other people who want to come in and regain the land that they'd had. God at one point tells Saul to go kill the Amalekites, all of them, the women, the children, everything. But he doesn't. He kills most of them, but he keeps the king as something kind of as a victory prize, and he keeps all the good animals because they're edible. And so Samuel comes and says, "How did the battle go?" And Saul says, "We did what God told us to do. It was wonderful." And Samuel says, "Really? Then what are all those sheep doing over there making noise?" Saul says, "Well, I kept some of the best of the animals to feed my people." Samuel says, "What did God tell you to do? Kill everything, all the people and all the animals." Yeah, right. Well, and I kept the king too. Samuel says, "This is it. You've not listened to God much, but this is a direct disobeying of what God told you to do." First, Samuel kills King Agag, lops his head off, and then he says, "God doesn't want to have anything else to do with you, Saul. You are no longer king." And he walks off. Samuel leaves and never during his lifetime, never sees Saul again. And yet Saul is still the king. Everybody saw him get anointed, so he's still the king. But Samuel goes and consults God, and God says, "I want you to pick someone from the tribe of Judah," not the oldest of that family, by the way, the youngest, the kid in the field, the little shepherd boy, David. Now, in what can only be described as a great example of this being a bit of a soap opera, Saul, who is no longer king in God's eyes, but in the people's eyes he gets headaches, he gets migraines, and they say, the best solution for migraines is harp music. And so they bring in a harp player, the best harp player in the area, old shepherd boy, David. And so here you have the future king, from God's point of view, the king now, but he's acting as a servant in the palace, in the temple, or the palace of King Saul. This doesn't go too well. In fact, in this painting, you can see that Saul gets so mad with David, tries to kill him a couple times. David's, on the other hand, doing well. They send him out. He takes some stones. He kills the big Philistine giant Goliath. Everybody thinks David is like the man. Saul just doesn't know what to do. But he lives his life out until the Battle of Gilboa. Saul doesn't know how to survive. It's all of his people, his children, including his son Jonathan, they're all killed. And he knows that if he is caught, he'll be tortured and then probably have his head stuck on a pike and carried around. So he asks his young man, his squire, to kill him. Squire runs off, and so Saul throws himself on his own sword. And yeah, that's the origin of that phrase, kills himself. One came down, a failed choice? Do we not roll the dice right? Or is this just an example of God's choosing someone flawed whose flaws could never be overcome? Take your pick. Who's next? Well, Saul has a son, Ishbosheth. And so by right, the son of the king, the oldest son of the king, should be king, right? Well, except that we know that the intention is that the next king be David. Many of you know this is the statue of David in Florence, Italy, by Michelangelo. What's notably wrong about the sculpture, and I sat there in the Duomo and looked at it for many hours, for an hour easily, marveling at it when Leanne walked up and said, "I thought David was circumcised." Nevertheless, doesn't really matter. Okay, we move down in the timeline some more now, and we'll move past Saul to David. Now, Saul's territory wasn't very large, really, honestly. This is the star here is Jerusalem, although it's not quite a big city yet. But this was Saul's area. It wasn't a whole lot compared to what they all had when they were all 12 tribes together. But by the time David's done, this thing is massive. It's bigger than it was even when in the time of the judges. And this is the zenith of the land, the promised land, as far as the children of Abraham are concerned. What happens with David is that there's a natural division. He can't get all of the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin sides with the tribe of Judah. But the other 10 tribes, which are all north of them, they're all like, well, why do you get to have the king? And so there's kind of a natural division between the northern tribes and the southern tribes. And David solves that by taking the ark and creating a city called Jerusalem, right there on the boundary between Judah and Benjamin on the south and then the other 10 tribes on the north. This sort of helps things along and keeps peace among the children of Abraham. But there's still war, and there's still battles, and there's still fighting with the Philistines and Moab, all these other folks. But David is a good warrior king, and he, in general, brings a time of relative peace. We hear the story of David 2 times in the Bible. We have it in the book of Chronicles, and then we have it in the books of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel. In Chronicles, and I won't read all of this, but just so that you understand, the Lord killed Saul. That's not what I said a few minutes ago, I know. Made David king. He leads an army. They win. He brings the ark to Jerusalem. There's lots of dancing. He asks Nathan about building some place for the ark to go. And God says, your son will take care of that. There's more war, more victories. There's a census. Satan makes David take a census. The temple construction is ready, and David ends up a happy man. Now, to be honest with you, Chronicles is not part of our history as we teach it because, frankly, it's a bit revisionist. It tells all the good parts of David's story, sort of leaves most of the bad parts out. And you know some of those. But we'll remind you that Saul dies, and there's intrigue, and it takes a few years, but David eventually prevails as king. He leads the army. They bring the ark to Jerusalem. He asks Nathan about building a temple, place to put the ark. He winds up getting another covenant. We'll talk about that covenant in just a moment. There's more wars, more victories. There's the story of Bathsheba, Uriah, and Nathan's message. I won't go into that right now because we're kind of going fast. But David's got this, he's done this thing with Bathsheba, which he shouldn't have done. And he uses a bit of a corrupt approach to try to cover up this sexual relationship he has with another man's wife. Eventually Nathan calls him on it. And David is crushed. David knows he's done wrong, but now it's been confronted that God understands it and God knows it. And David, unfortunately, just can't get out of his own way at this point. He can't bring himself to convict others because he himself has been so crushed by the judgment of his own actions. He had it coming, he did wrong, but it becomes a character flaw in David for the rest of his life. We'll look at that when we look at his children in a minute. And we'll tell you, here are the stories of what happens with his children. We'll go over them in a couple more minutes on another slide. And then he gets old and cold, and David leaves his 2 remaining older sons, Adonijah and Solomon, to battle it out to have the crown. David doesn't die a happy man in Samuel. Then there's this covenant, and it's a divine covenant, and here are the parts. David, I will make you personally great. I will pick a place for my people. They will not be disturbed. They will not be slaves. They will live in peace. Your son, which as it works out is Solomon, the first living son by Bathsheba, will succeed you, and he will build the temple. I will establish his rule forever. I will punish wrong, remember that. And the dynasty, and the word here, the word is house, and here it means the house as in the building, and a house as well as a lineage of people, and it's a bit of a double use word in Hebrew as well as English. I will establish a dynasty that will never end. Okay? That's a divine commitment. David doesn't have to promise that they'll do anything. This is the commitment God makes to the people who follow from David. Let's close out on David here real quick. David has the son, he has the sexual thing he has with Bathsheba creates a son. That son dies. God said it would, and it does. Actually, God told Samuel to tell David that was how it would be. His next oldest son is Amnon. Amnon rapes his half-sister. And so Absalom, mad that dad is apparently unable to punish the brother, Absalom says, well, if dad's not going to punish him, I will, and he kills his brother. Absalom then essentially revolts against dad because dad's clearly unable to take care of things. Eventually he runs David out of Jerusalem. Eventually David's army rises up and goes against Absalom. Absalom is riding along on a donkey, gets hung up in the trees, winds up hanging there, and despite orders from David not to, David's general Joab kills Absalom, killing off another son. The next oldest son is Adonijah, and he wants to be the king, and so he has a party to coronate himself as David gets old. David gets old, and we know this because it says David could no longer stay warm, and that's speak for too old to be king. Adonijah has a party, but meanwhile, Bathsheba and Solomon, just as Rebekah and Isaac did, go in to David and say, who should be king? And David says Solomon. Solomon, probably cleverly, decides to consolidate things, and he has his brother killed. So, if you want to talk about how David was as a parent, we got murder, we got rape, we got all kind of intrigue. So, again, like other people in the Old Testament, David not perfect. Okay, moving on to the son that survived is Solomon. And we always refer to Solomon as Solomon the Wise, right? God said, I'm going to give you one gift. What do you want? Solomon says, I like wisdom. You have chosen wisely. He was wise. He was equitable. You know the story of the two women who are arguing over the baby. And he says, well, let's split the baby. And the one who is the real mother screams the loudest, and he figures it out. He consolidates his power. He erases, kills his competitors. He negotiates a peace with all the surrounding nations. How does he do that? We'll get to that in a minute. He wrote 3,000 Proverbs, 1,000 Psalms, and 3 books of the Bible, according to rabbinical tradition. Built a beautiful temple, 180 feet by 90 feet, mined gold to the point that silver didn't have value. Ooh. And he sets up his son Rehoboam to succeed him. That's good King Solomon. Unwise King Solomon took 700 wives, mostly foreigners, mostly married, to create these pacts of peace that led to this peace he negotiated, plus 300 concubines and all the gods they brought with them. So our drive to be one people worshiping one God got very muted in the time of Solomon. And he wasn't wise enough to convert them all to monotheism, and so we have a lot of polytheism going on here. He goes and gets horses from Egypt, which he was also told not to do. He acquires staggering wealth, but all of the temple and the palace for Solomon that are both built are all built on the back of the slavery of his own people. Did not make Solomon popular. He made all the people of all 12 tribes help build these things and made them essentially slave labor and taxed them for it as well. He built a palace twice as big as the temple and another palace for all the wives. I don't know how you kept track of birthdays if you had 700 wives. I do not. So when Solomon is done, he's lost some of the territory that David had. but it's well consolidated, and he's in a peaceful state with all the others. And so the hope is that he can then pass that on to his son Rehoboam. Well, Rehoboam, being of, like Solomon and David before him, being of the tribe of Judah, he runs head into this, well, we're really not impressed with you people from Judah, and we'd like to see the kingship sort of move around to some other tribes. So the 10 northern tribes come and say, look, are you going to be like your father? Are you going to put us in slave chains and make us build things? So Rehoboam goes to his father's advisors, who had advised, the old men who were on with Solomon, and they say, what do you think? And they say, no, tell him it's good. We got it. We got the palaces are built, temples built, we're all good. Not going to be like it was before. But Rehoboam goes to his buddies, all of whom grew up like he did, with a silver spoon in his mouth and a big fancy palace, and they say, no, tell him we're going to make it even worse. Idiot. Rehoboam tells them, B. We're going to make it worse. And the 10 tribes say, then we're out of here. Bye-bye. And Jeroboam and the leader, as the leader, the 10 other tribes of the 10 northern tribes, all except Judah and Benjamin, they split, and this schism lasts for the rest of time. The decision here is permanent. That leaves Rehoboam. He loses all of the northern territories. He's only got little bits and pieces of what's Judah. In fact, here's a better map, I think, perhaps. Here's the kingdom of Judah. The Philistines and all these other tribes are all still out here. Here's the area of Israel is the word now we give to the northern 10 tribes. We call the southern tribes it's Judah and Benjamin, but we call them Judah, Judes. The Judahites, that will eventually morph into the word Jews, and then the northern tribes, the tribe of Israel, 10 tribes. The roots here are jealousy, but the problem is that that when they split the tribes, Jerusalem and the temple and the ark stayed in the south with Judah. So where do we go to do sacrifices and worship Yahweh if we're in the northern tribes? Well, they have to create their own. They create their own laws, and they pick a different mountain to go worship on, and create 2 places, one in Bethel, and one up higher in the old territory of Dan, and they create 2 temples, and that's where they go to worship their God. Their God is the God of the Judahites. It's just that they can't worship him. Now, this does not make Yahweh happy. He wants his people to be as one, to be that shining light to the world, not to be an infighting bunch of tribes, but it's not how it plays out. And so they have to create a set of kings in the northern tribes, and then there's a set of kings in the southern tribes. Let's look at those. We'll start with the northern tribes. Ephraim is the first king, or I'm sorry, Jeroboam is the first king. He's sort of the leader of the rebellion. He's from the tribe of Ephraim. But every time you see the colors changing, again, these are from the Divine Drama. I love this chart. Every time the colors change, it's a different tribe. And you can see by the daggers with the blood on them that most of these changes of which tribe is running is because somebody goes and kills the previous king. And so we have a series of kings, and it doesn't last it lasts essentially for 200 years, and then they fall. We'll talk about that in a minute, but the northern tribes all fall at the same time to the Samaritans, to the Assyrians technically. Tribe of Judah, however, stays in one family, tribe of Judah, right? Because in the covenant with David, it's your house that I'm going to use as my lineage. And so these are the kings. Now, some of them get the Consumer Reports check mark of approval as a best buy. Some of them don't. Some are good, some are not. A couple of them are assassinated. But they're all from Judah, and they're all worshiping Yahweh in Jerusalem as God intended. This lasts a whole lot longer, well, a couple or 100 years, until the Babylonians come along in 597, and then again in 587. Okay. We will concentrate on two kings, just some as examples. All of these kings are considered bad, but we'll look at one really bad one. Some of these kings are considered good. We'll look at the particularly good one. Okay? The king that's bad is King Ahab. He is the 7th king of the northern tribes. Here's when he ruled. He married Jezebel. Many of you have heard that name. And she leads him to worship Baal, which is another god, a god that we'll introduce to you in a minute. Baal and Astarte are gods, man and woman gods, worshipped by many of the Phoenicians and other tribes around the area. At some point, King Ahab gets confronted by the prophet Elijah and challenges the king's prophets to a little barbecue battle. You can read about that, and you'll see that basically the story is, okay, you put out a wood fire and some meat on yours, and your God will cook that barbecue. My God, Yahweh, will cook mine, and I'm going to soak all the wood and water and everything. Then their God can't seem to make any fire, and Yahweh creates fire and a barbecue. And this doesn't make Elijah real popular with King Ahab, because he's called him out essentially. And so his death is ordered, but it works out that Ahab and Jezebel die instead, and Elijah goes off in a chariot of fire. Elijah doesn't really die, at least in the storyline. He goes off somewhere. Good old King Josiah is the 15th king of Judah, and he becomes king very young. I mean, he's probably 8 when he's coronated. His father is killed in a palace revolt. He is raised by the wise men, the prophets of the time, and so he winds up being a pretty good king. He decides that we need to take some money and renovate the temple. It's kind of old, looking a little scruffy, and he does it without doing tax dollars. He's going to pay people to do the carpentry in the temple, unlike Solomon. And when they tear the thing apart, they find this scroll. We think it's probably the scroll of the book of Deuteronomy. We're not sure, but we think. And they read it, and they bring it to Josiah, and he reads it, and he goes, oh my gosh, there's all these laws. There's this thing called circumcision, and man, we haven't been doing that since when? Well, as it works out, they haven't done circumcision since the time of before Moses. They haven't been keeping the Passover since they got to the Promised Land. And Josiah's like, oh my gosh, we are really in trouble. God's got to be really angry with us. We need to reform things. And Josiah does. And people come along with that, and things are looking like they're going to get back to being the chosen people again. Unfortunately, the Egyptians come along, and Josiah picks the wrong side of that battle to be on. And when the Egyptians he can't get the Egyptians to side correctly in the battle with the Babylonians win, and eventually that ends lots of things, including Josiah's reign. This leads to 2 defeats. In the northern tribes, they defended themselves against the Assyrians for a long time, but after a while, Sargon II conquers the Assyrians in 721 BC and take all 10 tribes. Where does he take them? He doesn't take them. He takes a few of them up to the Assyrian lands, but mostly he moves his people in. The Assyrians don't conquer by killing people. They subdue them and then force them to intermarry with the other Assyrians. They accumulate them into their people. What this does is ruin the bloodline of the Hebrews, right? The northern tribes are still tribes of Abraham. They are tribes because they are descendants of Abraham, except now all of their people are half-breeds. They're half Assyrian and half Hebrew. This term then is they're named for the area that they now live in, which is called Samaria. So these people will now be known as Samaritans. We'll come back to that one when we get to the story that Jesus will tell about the Good Samaritan. But But the line that we created, where they worshipped at Mount Gerizim and the Pentateuch that they wrote, all of that separates them from the God of Jacob and Abraham and Isaac. Myth and lore says these tribes went all kind of places. Some say they went to the New World, some say they went to Ireland, some say they went all these various places. But for all intents and purposes, they are lost. Their bloodline is destroyed, and the people that were the northern 10 tribes are lost and gone forever. Now the Assyrians and the Egyptians, who have taken them over, themselves are defeated by the Babylonians in Carchemish at 605 BC. So it is the Babylonians who show up on the doorstep of the Judahites, and things go okay for a while, but the Babylonians begin to start doing some raids, and eventually one of Josiah's successors, King Zedekiah, tries to align with the Egyptians, but it's a losing side, and the Babylonians take over. Nebuchadnezzar II is the king of the Babylonians. They come in, destroy Jerusalem, level the temple, take away the ark to who knows where. We know where the Ark of the Covenant is. If you saw the movie, it's in a government warehouse in Springfield, Virginia. It's at the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark. You see them pack it up. It's in Springfield. You needed to know that. But the ark is left, and King Zedekiah is killed. Ooh. The best and the brightest, and the way the Babylonians do it is they don't intermarry anybody. They just take the best and the brightest of a civilization and bring them back to Babylon and make things bigger and brighter for their society. So some of the Judahites get taken to Babylon. Some of them they say this isn't going to work, and they head west with the Egyptians back to Egypt. And some of them, mostly the poorest ones, stay in what's left of Jerusalem and what's left of the Promised Land. So it splits it all up, but they retain their bloodline, their historical being descendants of Judah and of David. Eventually, there's a desire to keep the religious heritage, and so in some part, led by Jeremiah, the people are going to try to start writing all this story down as history and to try to capture it, codify it. And so Jeremiah eventually goes back to Jerusalem and eventually prophesies that all will return, and then the Babylonians are themselves defeated by the Persians at the Battle of Opis in 539 BC, and the Persians say, y'all go on home. Fine. That was your land. King Cyrus of Persia, who conquers the Babylonians, says, please go back and please recreate your civilization. And so that's what they do. They go back, but to what? But to what? It's hard to know, because some of them have gone to Egypt, some, the northern tribes are gone. The people will come back from Babylon, but there's no Jerusalem, there's no temple, there's no ark. There may not even be a God. We don't know. So we ask ourselves these questions. If you're a Jew in Babylon, ask yourself, so the northern tribes were evil, right? They didn't worship Yahweh correctly. They got what they had coming to them. But David was promised peace and a line that the house of David would rule forever. But Zedekiah is dead. So the prophets of Isaiah and Jeremiah promise that we'll go back home, but what's left? Jerusalem's in ruins, the temple's gone, the ark's gone. Do we really want to go there and start over? Were we being punished? Was God's hand in this? Did the Babylonian gods defeat our God, or did our God let us be conquered to get our attention? You could look at it this way, that God the parent called time out on his people and said, I'm going to send you to the corner, to Babylon, for 40 or so years so I can get your attention. So we can get back down to the root of all this, which is being in an agape relationship with me as your God and with each other as a community. And what then, in God's name, do we have to do to not get punished like that again? Okay, we're going to put a little break here. We've got a little bit left, so we're going to be 3.5 lessons to get you through this. So we're going to come back. with a couple of little things that will get us from the return from Babylon right up to the edge of the beginning of the New Testament. So stay tuned.